Chapter 10. Taming the Reactor. In Pripyat on the morning of April the 27th, it was not only children playing in the sand who knew nothing about the radioactivity. The yellowish granular substance also seemed irresistibly attractive to the adults who knew the most about the accident and its consequences. About 1/3 of a mile from the Pripyat party headquarters, where the government commission held its meetings, there was a large mound of sand intended for construction purposes. From the windows of nearby apartment buildings, one could see 3 men in their mid-40s, one dressed in a general's uniform and the others in expensive business suits, digging into the mound to fill the sacks they had brought with them. The 3 sand diggers sweated as they worked, their clothing becoming grimier and grimier, but the number of filled sacks grew as well. The general was Nikolai Antoshkin, Chief of Staff of the Kiev District Air Force Command and commanding officer of the helicopter unit that had turned the plaza in front of party headquarters into its landing pad earlier that morning. The 2 men in business suits were Alexander Meshkov, the first deputy of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building under the powerful Yefim Slavsky, and Gennady Shasharin, the chief engineer of the Nuclear Power Directorate of the Soviet Ministry of Energy and Electrification. They were loading sandbags to be dropped by Antoshkin's helicopters into the mouth of the damaged reactor in order to seal it off and stop further emissions of radiation. The decision to begin the airdrops had been made the previous night, but its execution was postponed until daybreak of April the 27th. The time was needed to allow Antoshkin's helicopter pilots to get into the area, create a landing pad, and reconnoiter the approaches to the reactor. After the helicopters were in position, General Antoshkin had asked Boris Shecherbina, the head of the government commission, to provide people and equipment to fill the sandbags and load them onto the helicopters. His pilots were ready. Shecherbina did not conceal his irritation. He wanted Antoshkin's pilots to do the job. It was not the Commission's responsibility. Antoshkin insisted that he needed extra help. Shecherbina told the general to take Meshkov and Shasharin and let them fill the sandbags. The senior officials followed orders. Shecherbina was extremely impatient, recalled Shasharin. With the helicopter engines roaring outside, he yelled at the top of his voice that we were lousy workers, that we were no good. He drove us like cattle, all of us, ministers, deputy ministers, generals, not to mention the others, telling us that we were very good at blowing up reactors, but useless when it came to filling sandbags. Shecherbina was running the show like an ancient despot. By the morning of April the 27th, he had already recovered from the earlier shock and uncertainty when he could not figure out what had happened and had no plan of action. Now, with a clear goal before him, he switched to his hectoring mode of managing people and situations. That was the old, proven manner of dealing with subordinates. It had been adopted by Stalin's managers in the industrialization and forced collectivization drives of the 1930s. The protocol was to bully subordinates into submission and then demand the fulfillment of unrealistic production quotas. Unless Antoshkin, Shasharin, and Meshkov could organize others to do the job, they had to fill the sandbags themselves. After a bit, they did round up more people and shovels. With my own eyes, I saw company commanders and junior officers filling sandbags, loading them onto helicopters, flying, reaching their target, dumping the bags, returning and repeating the operation, recalled Valery Legasov. He was not impressed. For about 2 days, April the 27th and the 28th, both the Ministry of Energy and the local authorities were completely unable to organize the work, so urgent and clear-cut, of preparing the materials that had to be thrown into the well of the reactor, he remembered. From about the 29th, order was established. Appropriate quarries were found, and lead was supplied. By that time, people were in place and things began to work properly. At about the same time, the helicopter pilots worked out a highly effective way of carrying out their operations, establishing an observation post on the roof of the district party committee in Pripyat, From there, they directed the teams above Unit 4 to their targets. The task of filling sandbags was eventually entrusted to the leaders of the Pripyat branch of the Young Communist League, Komsomol, who went to the workers' dormitories and asked people for help. The response was strong, but there was still a shortage of shovels, sandbags, and fabric to tie up the filled bags. At first, they began using the supplies of red fabric stored for the May Day parade. Once the city was evacuated, the workers were filling bags brought from outside, mainly from nearby villages. As in wartime, most of the workers were women. One of them, a Chernobyl resident named Valentina Kovalenko, recalled, "They said that there was trouble and that we had to help by going to the sandpit and filling bags. And there it was mainly we women who loaded that sand from morning to night." The Ukrainian authorities provided the workforce, while Moscow officials offered financial incentives. Once the Komsomol organizers and local officials took over the job of mobilizing workers to fill the sandbags, General Antoshkin returned to his primary duty, coordinating the efforts of helicopter pilots to dump the sandbags into the reactor in order to seal it off. Even before Shecherbina sent him to dig sand, Antoshkin had flown over the reactor with his officers and charted the approaches to the ruined Unit 4. There were two major challenges. First, pilots unfamiliar with the layout of the power plant initially found it difficult to identify the location of the reactor, which was spewing invisible clouds of radiation into the air, but producing little smoke. And second, approaching the reactor by air was difficult because the tall exhaust pipe had survived the explosion. Antoshkin and his pilots dealt with both problems, charting a route that would be followed thousands of times in the coming days. Soon, with a deafening roar, helicopter followed helicopter from the main square of Pripyat to the damaged reactor less than 3 kilometers away. When a helicopter reached its destination with its load of sandbags and hovered over the reactor, the crew opened the hatch and dropped the bags by hand. The mission was all but impossible. The opening in the damaged reactor, the portion not covered by the Elena shield, was only 5 meters wide. Before they could close the hatch, the radioactive clouds produced by dropping the bags onto the reactor brought radioactive gases and particles into the helicopter cabin. The level of radioactivity would jump from 500 to as many as 1,800 rontgens per hour with every additional drop. By the end of the day, Antoshkin's men had made 110 sorties and dropped 150 tons of sand. That was a great achievement, but not great enough to satisfy Shecherbina. On the evening of April the 27th, when the exhausted General Antoshkin reported the results to Shecherbina, the Deputy Prime Minister did not respond with thanks. Instead, he shouted abuse at Antoshkin and his civilian counterpart, Shesharin, for what seemed an eternity. He removed Shesharin from the task of supervising the delivery of sandbags. Shecherbina demanded more sorties and more tons of sand. Ukrainian designers promptly created a hook that, attached to a helicopter, could carry dozens of bags wrapped in a parachute. The hook, they produced 30,000 of them, could be released from the helicopter cabin without the pilot opening the hatch and getting additional exposure to radioactive gases and particles. This, along with another innovation, the reinforcement of helicopter floors with lead plates, saved the lives of many pilots. But the task before them was almost impossible to achieve. Since the opening into the core of the reactor was so narrow, perhaps no more than 20% of the loads they dropped made it to the reactor. And then there was the radiation. At first, the helicopter pilots did not know the potency of the radioactive fields, but that knowledge came quite soon, and only partly from the scales of dosimeters. The weather was wonderful, the sun was shining, everything was in bloom, coming back to life. But nearby there was a crow that could not take flight. It was too weak, remembered one helicopter pilot, Valery Shmakov. Then we understood that the situation was serious. Many of his colleagues were vomiting, while others got a radiation tan. Shmakov felt extremely tired the whole time, one of the symptoms of radioactive poisoning reported by many people who came to Pripyat immediately after the explosion. He and his fellow pilots began to believe that they were doomed. Once we started making flights above the reactor and going through the disinfection process, when our apparatus and clothing were treated with a special substance, we discussed among ourselves that the flights were really dangerous, and that perhaps we should take the whole brunt of the blow, becoming condemned men, as it were, now that we had become involved, recalled Shmakov. The first pilots, including General Antoshkin himself, wore no protective gear as they hovered over the reactor. It was estimated that in order to drop the sandbags, the pilots had to hover over the eye of the nuclear volcano for about 4 minutes. A single trip would thus expose the crew to between 20 and 80 Rontgens, meaning that they should have been sent to the hospital immediately upon their return. In reality, for 8 long days they would make flights day in and day out, accumulating extremely high, if not lethal, doses of radiation. Their doses were measured on the basis of the radioactivity of their clothes, not according to the level of radioactivity above the reactor. By the time the mission was completed in early May, none of the pilots who had made the first drops on the afternoon of April the 27th were still on site. Most of them were being treated for radiation sickness in the hospitals of Kiev. Boris Chicherbina wanted sand on the reactor, and he got it. But was he right to order the bombing runs? He followed the advice of his chief scientific expert, Valery Legasov. But what if Legasov and his scientists were wrong? Some of Legasov's colleagues at the Institute of Nuclear Energy in Moscow believed that he was dead wrong. No one knew what had caused the original explosion, or those that followed, or what was going on inside the reactor. Could it be that sealing the reactor with a pile of sand would cause a new explosion instead of extinguishing the fire caused by the first one? On the night of April the 27th, Shasharin, recently released from filling sandbags, sat down with leading scientists, including Legasov, to assess the situation. The first question that worried all of us was whether the reactor, or part of it, was working or not, that is, whether the production of short-lived radioactive isotopes was still going on, recalled Legasov. Measurements had to be taken on the spot. They used an armored vehicle equipped with instruments for measuring gamma and neutron activity, bringing it as close to the damaged reactor as they could. The results were devastating. The counters recorded high levels of neutron radiation. That could mean the reaction was still going on. The reactor was alive and could explode in another blast much more powerful than the one that had ruined Unit 4 and made the government commission order the evacuation of Pripyat. The next blast might not only destroy the entire power plant, but also release radioactive clouds large enough to make a good part of Europe uninhabitable. Legasov himself got into the armored vehicle and ordered that it be driven to the reactor. He soon realized that his measurements of neutrons, the ionizing subatomic particles that could reveal what was going on with the reactor, might be affected by powerful gamma fields, another component of the ionizing radiation. He therefore proposed a different method of measuring the radioactivity within the reactor. We obtained the most reliable information on the status of the reactor by assessing the correlation of short and relatively long-lived isotopes of iodine-134 and 131, and by means of radiochemical measurements, he recalled. They soon realized that short-lived isotopes of iodine were not being produced. Consequently, the reactor was not working and was in subcritical condition. That was a huge relief. They reported to Moscow that the measurements undertaken by the members of the State Commission showed a value of 20 neutrons per square centimetre per second. Admittedly, remembered Shasharin, we were measuring from a distance and through concrete. Legasov's next major task was to keep the temperature of the burning graphite in the reactor at a level that would not allow the capsules of uranium fuel to release additional radiation. He proposed using boron, a rare chemical element that absorbed neutrons, to keep the reactor from overheating. But first he had to convince his bosses in Moscow and Pripyat to accept that idea, and then get enough lead, there was enough boron in the plant's warehouse, to do the job. His superiors in Moscow, especially Anatoly Alexandrov, the director of the Institute of Nuclear Energy and head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, were reluctant to endorse the idea. Alexandrov proposed using clay instead of boron. Shcherbina decided to use both clay and boron. He just needed to know how much lead, boron, and other substances were needed. When Legasov asked for 2,000 tons of lead, but said that that would probably be insufficient, Shcherbina ordered 6,000 tons. It was a lot, but he did not care. The entire Soviet economy was at his disposal. The helicopter pilots would now drop not only sand, but also clay, boron, and lead into the opening of the reactor. Sand was needed to extinguish the graphite fire, lead to lower the temperature of the burning graphite, and boron and clay to prevent a chain reaction. So went the argument adopted by Shcherbina and his commission. But some scientists tried to convince Legasov that a chain reaction was a theoretical impossibility, as the fuel channels had been destroyed, and that all that was going on inside the reactor was the burning of graphite, thus boron was not required. Valentin Fedulenko, the Institute of Nuclear Energy's top expert on RBMK reactors, who arrived in Pripyat on the afternoon of April the 27th, was convinced that there was no need for sand, clay, or lead. Anatoly Alexandrov, one of the fathers of the RBMK reactor, had sent Fedulenko to Pripyat specifically to offer Legasov scientific advice, given that Legasov was a chemist, not a physicist by training or by academic interest, and was never involved in work on RBMK reactors. On the evening of April the 27th, the first night of his stay in Pripyat, Fedulenko visited Konstantin Polushkin, the first scientist to observe the reactor from above and conclude that it had been destroyed. Polushkin showed Fedulenko and some fellow scientists the film of the damaged reactor that he had shot from a helicopter that day. On the screen, Fedulenko could see that the massive Elena plate was still in place, covering most of the reactor and making it extremely difficult for the helicopter pilots to drop their loads into the reactor's half-open mouth. Fedulenko believed that the strategy chosen on Legasov's advice was not only useless, but also harmful. While most of the loads dropped by the helicopter pilots, at a huge cost to their health and safety, did not get into the reactor, every drop that did created a small radioactive explosion that increased radiation levels. A second later, a black mushroom of fuel and graphite, dust and ash, exactly like the mushroom of an atomic explosion, but miniature and very black, rose above the ruined unit, wrote Fedulenko, describing the scene that he witnessed after one of the airdrops. In 3 or 4 seconds, the cap of the ominous mushroom rose to the height of about 2/3 of the ventilation pipe, and slowly began to descend in heavy, shaggy black bands, resembling rain from a cloud against the background of a grey sky. In 10 to 12 seconds, the mushroom disappeared and the sky became clear. The wind blew away the mushroom cloud. Fedulenko argued against the continuing bombardment of the reactor, but Legasov would not listen. He told Fedulenko, yes, radioactive activity increased sharply after we began dumping sand and other substances, but that's probably temporary. He also added, after one of their conversations, people won't understand if we do nothing. Indeed, the strategy of bombarding the reactor had been approved at the very top of the Soviet power pyramid. There, the main concern was not the spread of radiation because of the airdrops, but the possibility of a new explosion. That was the main question addressed to scientists on the evening of April the 27th, by Vladimir Dolgich, the Central Committee's secretary in charge of the energy sector. On the morning of April the 28th, Dolgich informed Mikhail Gorbachev and the entire Soviet leadership in person that Unit 4 had been destroyed by the blast and had to be buried. The process had begun with airdrops of sand, lead, clay, and boron. Gorbachev asked him, "Are bags of sand and boron being dropped from the air?" "From helicopters," answered Dolgich, giving a very low number. 60 bags have been dropped. 1,800 are needed, but helicopter flights are not safe either. His data probably reflected activity as of the middle of the previous day. When Gorbachev asked Marshal Sergei Akrameyev, the chief of the Soviet Army General Staff, what should be done under the circumstances, he responded, "The only realistic thing is to cover the reactor with bags of sand and boron." Boris Shcherbina did all he could to bury the reactor as soon as possible. Every day the amount of sand, lead and boron dropped on the reactor increased. 300 tons on April the 28th, 750 tons on April the 29th, and 1,500 tons on April the 30th. The peak was reached on May the 1st, when 1,900 tons of sand were dropped. Further airdrops were cancelled, out of fear that the pile was becoming too big and heavy. Its weight might bring the reactor crashing down into the underground structures of the plant, causing the radioactive poisoning of groundwater. Altogether, close to 5,000 tons of various substances, mostly sand, were dropped onto the reactor. It is a miracle that it did not collapse into the unit's lower levels. Was the sacrifice of the helicopter pilots justified? Legasov believed that it was. Levels of radioactivity around the reactor were falling. Later, he and his fellow scientists would estimate that 25% of all the radioactivity released by the explosion had been emitted during the first 24 hours after the accident on April the 26th. By May the 2nd, the emissions had fallen to 1/6 of what they had been on the first day. Legasov was convinced that the decline was a result of the Commission's actions, especially the bombardment of the reactor from the air with sand and other substances. To many inhabitants of Ukraine, Belarus and Western Russia, this relative improvement seemed too little too late. As the helicopters dropped their loads on the reactor, the wind, which had blown west and north during the first days after the accident, switched directions to the east and south, contaminating new territories. The chemical warfare detachments under General Vladimir Pikolov, who arrived immediately after the accident and was in charge of the measurement of radioactivity levels and the mapping of radiation zones, were spread thinly and could not cope with the rapidly deteriorating situation. On April the 28th, one day after the evacuation of Pripyat, Boris Shcherbina and his commission decided, with the approval of Moscow, to create a 10-kilometer exclusion zone around the reactor and resettle the population from the entire zone. The Commission also decided to abandon Pripyat, where the radioactivity level was increasing. The Commission members and the operators of the power plant, altogether close to 5,000 people who stayed in the city to ensure the safe shutdown of the reactors, as well as police and military personnel brought to the city, were ill-equipped to deal with such high levels of radiation. Respirators were not available in the quantities required, and dosimeters were in short supply. Those available lacked batteries and were therefore useless. Potassium iodide pills were hard to get and were delivered too late, after residents' thyroid glands were already full of radioactive iodine from the atmosphere. Warning signs about high radiation fields were not posted, and the offices of high officials were among the most contaminated areas in the city. Woolen carpets in offices and corridors became repositories of radioactive particles and absorbed radiation. At police headquarters, it took 4 days to figure out what was going on and remove the carpets. Most of the scientists who flew in from Moscow to deal with the consequences of the accident knew the kind of danger they faced, but still often neglected to protect themselves. A macho, can-do attitude influenced the behavior of those who stayed in Pripyat. Young guys on the shift were smoking and talking on sight, wrote Fedulenko, describing one of his trips to the environs of the damaged reactor. A helicopter flew by. It was carrying its load in a net. The height was not great, and everything could be seen. It hovered above the ruined unit. It dropped its load. It flew off. The crowd on the open square was calm. They had happy faces, and no one was wearing a respirator. I felt for my respirator in my pocket, remembering that I had one. Somehow it felt embarrassing to put it on. Everyone's face was open. Like the others, he remained unprotected. The only obstacle between Fedolenko and the reactor, only a few hundred meters away, was the concrete wall of a nearby building. In Pripyat, radiation levels fluctuated around 1 Rontgen per hour. According to the norms later adopted for Soviet policemen in radioactive zones, an officer was allowed to spend no more than 20 hours in such conditions. The members of the government commission spent close to 60 hours in Pripyat. After that, along with everyone else who had stayed in the city after the first evacuation, they were finally told to leave for a safer place. Unlike the earlier evacuees, they knew that they were probably leaving Pripyat not just for 3 days, but forever. Valentin Fedolenko later described a scene of the exodus that he found unforgettable. Along the way, we stopped at a place where people were filling paper bags with sand to be dropped into the well of the Unit 4 reactor, he recalled. The supervisors were talking about something or other. I was struck by a scene that will long remain before my eyes. Against the background of the shadowy bulk of the station, the little houses of a small village were visible about half a kilometre away. Behind the fence was a ploughman with his plough, a horse in front of him. He was tilling his kitchen garden, a village idyll on a radioactive field. Before the last residents of Pripyat left their city, they performed their last duty to the first recorded victim of the accident, Volodymyr Shashinok. He had been taking readings of radiation levels at the time of the turbine test when the explosion destroyed pipes full of hot water and steam. Around 6 a.m. on April the 26th, Shashinok died of the severe burns to his body. When he was brought to the hospital, where his wife worked as a nurse, he could barely speak, but he had begged people around him to keep their distance, saying that he was from the reactor unit. When the time came for his burial, the plant had no bus available to take his body to the cemetery. In one of his last acts as deputy mayor of Pripyat, Alexander Yesaulov requisitioned a bus passing through the city, making it possible to give Shashinok a proper burial. The new wave of Pripyat evacuees settled in a scout camp called Skazoczni, a name meaning fairy tale, 35 kilometers south of the city. There was nothing fairy tale-ish about the camp, though, or about the radioactive conditions facing its inhabitants. One day after the move, radiation levels began to increase there as well. But they did not exceed 1,300 micro-rontgens per hour. That was still a good level in comparison to Pripyat's 1 Rontgen per hour. Along with the government commission, higher radiation levels were moving south, approaching the city of Kiev. On April the 28th, Valentina Shevchenko, the 51-year-old head of the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine, the anemic Soviet-era parliament, drove to those parts of the northern Kiev region where inhabitants of Pripyat had been temporarily resettled. She did so on her own initiative, without consulting Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, the all-powerful boss of Ukraine. I felt that a calamity had occurred, but that no one understood the full extent of the danger in the first days. I was concerned about how such numbers of people from Pripyat could be accommodated, what they needed immediately, so I set out for Chernobyl early in the morning of April the 28th, she recalled. She found the evacuees housed in schools and public buildings, as well as in homes of collective farmers nearby. They were a diverse crowd. Many were city dwellers who felt disoriented in a village environment. But whatever their background, they were put to work. Among them was the former First Lady of Pripyat, the wife of the director of the power plant, Valentina Brukhanova. Lyubov Kovalevskaya, the Pripyat journalist who had written in March about construction problems at the Chernobyl plant, ended up in the village of Maksimovichi near the town of Poliske. It soon became clear that radiation levels there were also high. The evacuees were ordered to board buses again, pregnant women and children first. They were checked by dosimetrists and found to be already contaminated. Imagine how a mother felt, remembered Kovalevskaya on coming up to a dosimetrist who measured radiation on her child's shoes. Dirty. Pants. Dirty. Hair. Dirty. The evacuation was done in a hurry and often resulted in families being divided. Children might be taken to one village, parents and grandparents to another. Radio loudspeakers installed in the main squares of villages began transmitting news and announcements. The most common notices were about parents looking for their children. Valentina Shevchenko observed that the evacuees in nearby villages seemed more bewildered than concerned. Many of them, comparing the new ordeal with the German occupation during World War II, found the current circumstances much less threatening. I went around the dwellings and spoke with people, taking an interest in how the evacuees had been received, recalled Shevchenko. People were calm, expecting that they would return to their homes very soon. Everyone told me, "What sort of danger is this? When the Germans were here, that was real danger. But now, it's sunny and warm, we need to plant our gardens." Shevchenko, a high government official who had no reliable information about the situation, felt much the same way. She and her driver had lunch outdoors and tasted food offered them by the locals. The danger posed by radiation came home to her late that night, when her car was stopped on the way back to Kiev in the village of Vilche. A radiation control post that had not been there in the morning was now checking passers-by, and her summer shoes were found to be highly radioactive. Shevchenko had to leave them at the post. The head of the Ukrainian parliament arrived home barefoot. On the following day, dosimetrists found radiation levels in Kiev reaching 100 microrontgens per hour, 5 times the norm. That was just the beginning.